Welcome back to In the Reads, the official podcast of Read Magazine, the oldest literary journal west of the Mississippi. My name is Ryan Steele. On today's episode, I sat down with Elsa Cruz, winner of the John Steinbeck Award this past fall for her fictional short story, Pipa. During our conversation, we discussed her experiences living all over the map, including Brazil, where she gained the inspiration for Pipa. Elsa currently resides in Portland, Oregon, which led to an interesting discussion on the public image Portland has developed in the media these past few years. Let's take a look.
I actually listen to a lot of podcasts like in the wellness world, like natural wellness. It's kind of something that feels really peaceful to me. So it's sort of like an outlet for me. And most of those are like conversations. So I just think that's really cool to like get a little insight into two people sitting down, two probably experts, sitting down to talk and seeing how that conversation might go. It's kind of like being a fly on the wall.
I think that's kind of the idea. You get like big stars that you only see in this super larger than life capacity, and then you see them acting normal, like they're just at the grocery store.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I love getting that insight into, they're normal people too. So I love that.
So I got to ask before I jump into the story, Pipa, which you submitted to Read Magazine. I read your author bio, and you say you love humidity.
Yeah.
That is insane to me.
I'm crazy. Yeah. So there's something so I grew up in North Florida, which I was just in a writing workshop. There was like 15 people and none of them had ever met someone from North Florida. So I guess it's not that common, but I think that like landscape, the nature, the natural world, I used to, complain about it a lot when I lived there. But somehow it made an impression on me. I don't know, it impacted me. And I think of it now, now I've lived in many different places. I live in the Pacific Northwest now, so it's not really humid. But I kind of go back to that as like a childhood sort of enchantment. It was this really, to me, kind of a wild nature. There's like alligators and bugs, and I don't know, it feels very magical to me now in retrospect. So I don't know, and sometimes I've been back to the area of Florida where I grew up, and there's something about it that I probably wouldn't move back, but there's something that I don't know, it's kind of like stepping into this world of nostalgia. And I think the weather is so hard to escape. It's kind of like the rain here in Portland where I live. You're just always confronted with it, and so you kind of have to like reckon with it, I guess. And so I think that the humidity is kind of like that for me in Florida. So I don't know. Yeah, it's kind of funny. In a way, sometimes I miss Florida, even though I'm always like looking for the next place to live. But yeah.
So what's the timeline been as far as, because you seem to travel a lot and live places for a long period of time as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love traveling. Traveling's always been one of my passions, but I think places are so important to me that a lot of times traveling's not enough. I really want to live in different places and get that experience. So I grew up in North Florida, Tallahassee, which is the capital of Florida. No one really knows about. But then when I was in high school, my family actually moved to Anchorage, Alaska. So it's like the complete opposite, the most different place you could move to. Something about that move really shaped me as a person. I think, I had already kind of had this desire to kind of like go far away from my hometown, and go see the world. And that was like a very safe way to do that. I was still like living with my family. I was a teenager, I was in high school. And so it was like a safe way for me to get that taste of like going out into the world and going somewhere completely different. So I lived there for a little while, and then I moved to New York City where I went to college. So I lived there for 4 years. And from there, it was this sort of like identity crisis, because I felt like, oh, I love New York so much. I've lived here for 4 years, and is it like a failure to leave, and there's just kind of this culture there of like, you are to be a true New Yorker, you have to stay there and like make it and live there for a long time. But I just realized I kind of had this restlessness to like do something new. So I kind of decided to leave New York and pursue like another part of my identity. So I actually took a job in Miami, which is really funny because I said I would not move back to Florida, but it's very different. It's almost a different state, North Florida, that's like right on the Georgia line, and then South Florida, Miami. It's two completely different places. So yeah, that was just like a totally different experience for me. I really liked living there. Also very humid, so it kind of brought me back to that, nostalgia for me. And then so I met my partner there, who's now my husband, and we lived there for a while, and then we made the decision to move to Brazil. He's from Brazil, and I don't know like exactly how we made the decision. It was just something from the very beginning when we, started kind of like dating, that we said like one day it would be really important to us for like us to go live there. And he had lived in the US for several years. And so I felt like, he's gotten to know my culture, learned my language, like learned how to be in my country. And it was really important for me to do the same for where he grew up, and we moved, yeah, right outside of Sao Paulo, Brazil. And we lived there for almost 3 years. That's where, this story Pipa came from. It's just my experience living there. And then we actually had to move back to the US for work. But we had a lot of freedom of like where to move. And so we're kind of crazy, but we just kind of like decided to pick a place that neither one of us had ever been to. So we kind of just like settled on Portland because it seemed like a good fit for us. Like there is a city that has a lot of great culture. Like we really love food and like art and everything. And then there's the nature that's just breathtaking. So yeah, we did like this kind of crazy adventure and just decided to like move somewhere that's a completely blank slate. And now I feel like, the Pacific Northwest has just inspired me so much as a writer, impacted me and shapes me as a person. It's like everywhere I go, I find this new part of my identity, kind of, that it's like was always there waiting to be discovered, I guess. So I'm absolutely loving it. I've been here about a year now and it's great.
Something interesting to me is it seems like prior to, unless I'm wrong about Tallahassee, up until college, it didn't seem like you were living in super literary art mecca towns or states.
Definitely not. Yeah, that was something I think that probably drove me to New York, is I was so desperate for that. Like I grew up just, reading nonstop, and actually my mom's an artist, and I grew up just having really good exposure to the arts, to music, to literature, the visual arts, but all from like my home, like reading books or watching something, or maybe going to like a traveling Broadway show or something like that, but it wasn't really that the place itself where I lived was shaped by the arts. And so I think I was just kind of desperate to go somewhere, where that could be part of my everyday exposure. And it definitely inspired me as a creative. I mean, I think you can't live somewhere like New York and not start feeding off of that creative energy that's just everywhere. And I felt the same like going to Miami. It's very different, but there's a lot of art. Sao Paulo has an incredible art scene. And I think so I just continue to like feed off of that energy. And then here in Portland, you have this incredible culinary creatives and musicians. And so I'm kind of like so grateful that I can always be inspired by the cities and the places I live. So
When you were writing Pipa, were you actively taking inspiration kind of from whether it be the atmosphere of Brazil or the Latin American literature that was maybe going around that you experienced?
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I knew that I had to write about my experience there, and I knew that I was just kind of confronted with this new world and this new culture and this new people, and Brazil's so diverse. I mean, there's so many people groups within Brazil, and there's such a rich history. And I think I just knew like, oh, I have to somehow start writing about this. And so I didn't really know what that would look like, but I definitely just started observing. I kept a journal. I think I called it something like something pretty cliche, like my life in Brazil or something like that. And I just would just write down just random things. If I went to the farmer's market and there was like a, different type of fruit that I had never seen before, I would just be like, okay, how could I describe the taste of that? And I would just write something down. Or, if I overheard a conversation, if there was like a new Portuguese word that I really thought was beautiful or something like that, I would just write it down. And then slowly all of those things started working their ways into, maybe not full stories, but drafts of stories or sketches of stories or something like that. So I didn't have a clear vision, but I definitely intentionally like gathered observations, I guess you could say.
It was kind of a cool thing for me because I feel like there's specifically out of Argentina in the past 5 or so years, there's been a really cool movement in literature of like magical realism.
Yeah. Hmm.
Mariana Enriquez, there was that book, Tender is the Flesh, the horror
Yeah.
novel that came out.
Hmm.
What was that reaction?
A magical realism is kind of my spirit. Like I
Oh,
just,
gotcha.
like when I think that's kind of how I think, and like that's how I see the world, just outside of story. I kind of always see that there's magic everywhere, even in the mundane things. And so I love that there's that legacy, in South America. And, I confess that I hadn't really read a lot of Brazilian writers before I moved to Brazil. I mean, I had read The Alchemist, Paulo Coelho, and I was in love, and that's very magical, maybe even more magical than realism. But I started kind of like realizing how much I needed to catch up and read, and so I started getting my hands on some translations. And then as I learned more Portuguese, I started trying to read. It's really hard to read in a second language, like fiction. I think is really hard, just because there's so much nuance and poetry, within the prose. But yeah, I started trying to read as much as I could, and just got really inspired. And I'm still, I mean, it's like there's so much I have to read still that I feel like before I can really say that I know Brazilian literature, maybe I'll never say that. But yeah, the magical realism thing is just, I would love to actually write more in that genre. I think because it's one of my favorite genres to read. So most of my stories incorporate some aspect of that, even if it's not like categorized as that genre, I think.
Well, it's interesting because in the story, the protagonist kind of like talks about which language they use for their own thoughts or their own dreams.
Hmm.
And you were in the story, he sometimes now thinks in English,
Yeah.
which is wild to me. There's that Modern Family clip that's really popular where I want to say she's Colombian, but the dad's new wife
Mhm.
says like, "You have any idea how hard it is to be clever when this isn't my first language?" Can you
Yeah.
imagine how like smart my Spanish thoughts are?
Yeah, I know. That's how I felt a lot, when I was in a situation in Brazil. I felt like I couldn't really communicate. I could communicate the meaning of what I was trying to say, but I wasn't using the exact language that I would have used if it was my like native language. And so a lot of times, as a writer, as a person who loves words, um, I was really frustrated, because I felt like, oh, I'm probably sounding kind of maybe like a child, in the way that I'm saying this. And I kind of realized I had a lot of maybe pride about that, that I kind of had to get over and be like, what is the point of communication? It's to get the meaning across. And then I started just learning to be patient with myself. But yeah, so the thinking in a second language, I think I had just like a big moment the first time that happened to me in Portuguese, that I was just so happy and so excited that like, oh, I think I'm thinking in my second language, and then I remembered that people told me that when you start dreaming in your second language, it's when it has really clicked in your brain. And so I remember the first time I dreamed in Portuguese, it was the first thing I had to tell everyone when I woke up. Can you believe I dreamed in Portuguese? And I felt so, I think just excited, that happened. And that's something that my husband talks a lot about too, that he'll be like, oh, sorry, I was thinking in Portuguese or I was thinking in English. We'll have these like little moments. And so I think it's just crazy how the mind works. I'm just constantly in awe of the human brain, to be able to process so quickly, and to be able to adapt so quickly. I think it's really cool. So, yeah, that's just made a big impression on me that like thinking in a language that you're not really speaking in at the moment.
It's interesting. I was so admittedly, even though the story we accepted of yours was for the John Steinbeck Award, which is in fiction, I took a second when I clicked on your website. I saw some of your nonfiction work. I was curious because the first one that came up was from American Magazine, is where you're discussing not using the word prostitute anymore, which is
Yeah.
very like eye grabbing. I was like, oh, okay, interesting. Like this could go any number of ways, but
Yeah.
it almost seemed it's focused more on the etymology of the word itself.
hmm
So when you write, are you kind of looking a lot like what the deeper meaning or what words really mean, other than just stringing together a sentence?
I think so. I think I am thinking a lot about meaning, and I think I do think a lot about how we use words, maybe like love, the word love, that doesn't necessarily mean what it means. If I say I love my partner and I also love sushi, it's a little bit different, although I really do love sushi. But, it's just, I think a lot about that. And I try to be careful, maybe not when I'm speaking, because it's, we have a conversational way of speaking, but when I'm writing, I really try to be really intentional about, yeah, getting to that deeper meaning. But I also think, especially for this story, I wasn't even necessarily being that intellectual about it. I think I was also thinking about how I felt about certain words, like when you're learning a new language, sometimes you have a feeling about a word before you know the meaning of it. And so I think I was kind of trying to get to that of like, there was words in Portuguese that I heard and I had a feeling about it. I had an emotion, a reaction, but I didn't know what it meant. And then, I had to ask, oh, what does this mean? Or I had to research it. And to me, that reminds me of like when you read, it may be something like Lord of the Rings or Narnia or something where the names themselves have, or maybe Harry Potter, where like the names have this emotional reaction attached to them. Like, that Mordor is a bad place. Like, you don't even have to know. You just like hear it. And I think that's like a brilliance of the writers and using language and using the roots of language. And so I think, I'm nowhere at that level in terms of like academics, but I think I tried to get to that idea of words invoking an emotion maybe before they even invoke a meaning, because you can translate a word and get the same meaning. It refers to the same object, but it doesn't have the same emotion or the same, maybe even personal meaning to use. So I think I was trying to kind of get at that. It's really complicated, it's a really nuanced idea, but that was kind of something that did inspire this story. So
Well, specifically, when I got to the ending, that was a very big wow. That is a full circle moment.
hmm
I thought that was poignant.
yeah, it's funny because I had the title of the story decided. I knew that the pipas were, the theme of the story, the kind of like driving imagery of the story. But I didn't know that was gonna be the name at the end. I didn't know that for a long time. And I think I was trying to figure out, I was like, what would be the good name? Like what would be a good name? And then it was kind of this realization of like, oh, it's been here all along. Like, and so that was a fun moment for me as a writer to kind of be maybe just surprised by my own story of like, there was something there that was, of course, inspired by my experiences that kind of revealed itself to me, that I had been maybe kind of trying to get across, but it had to like make itself known for me to get like, oh, this is what I'm trying to get across. So I love when that happens, because I'm just kind of along for the ride. Like the story is going to take on its own personality. So
I guess that's kind of the thing with perfectionism in writing is when a writer tries to micromanage just like every single word that goes in instead of going on the journey, they kind of lose what the thing actually is, what they thought it should have been.
oh yeah, totally. I have a hard time with that, because so much of my inspiration for different stories, or even, I have a draft of one novel that I'm working on. And even it's like I will get so attached to the original spark that started a story, and it's hard to let the story take you somewhere different. I'm working on another story right now. And I kind of realized that the story itself was telling me to go in a very different direction. And I realized like it's hard to like let go of those original ideas I had. But then at the same time, it's a really cool experience to kind of see that it take on a life of its own. So I think you kind of have to always be, I don't know, have a lot of like humility and respect for this mystery of story, and Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Big Magic. It's one of my favorite books about the creative process. And she talks about that a lot. She talks about how there's just kind of this thing happening and she's just trying to like get it down on paper. She can't really control it. And I think that's true. I think we have to be really sensitive to that.
So, living, I mean, I suppose Portland is a little far from Seattle, but AWP, the publishing awards, were in Seattle this year. Were you able to make it by chance?
I was not. I wish I could have gone. I wasn't able to because of work, but yeah, that I felt a little bit like, I don't know, like some camaraderie. It's like it's so close. So that was really cool.
How's Portland been as far as literary community? Because Tin House is in Portland, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
yes, it is. So I think it's been really good for me. I've been able to join a few different writers groups, and some of them are workshop groups, and some of them are just sort of like accountability groups. Like we go to a bar or something and we just write, and everyone's like, you have to write because we're all watching you. You can't check your phone or anything like that. And I have just been in awe of how many really amazing writers that I'm just like meeting without even trying, really like there's just so many interesting people here. And I still feel like I haven't scratched the surface in terms of like going to events or workshops or, retreats and things like that. I think it's a little bit overwhelming, even in a good way. There's so much. So I think I just feel really lucky that I get to live here.
It's my because my younger brother actually lives in Portland at the moment. He went to University of Oregon, but there was a big
Okay.
thing for a while. Social media news maybe blows this up more than because he says all that political turmoil, all the riots, all that. That's kind of downtown, but there's
Mhm.
also I feel like a vibe shift happening right now. Now that kind of COVID's coming to an end, it's a new decade. Have you kind of noticed Portland moving more towards the old hippie thing versus sort of the anger?
Yeah, I maybe am not the best person to ask because I've only been here a year. And so I feel like I kind of got here kind of after things were quieting down. But there's still like you can still see like the after effects. I mean, a lot of things downtown they are still boarded up, some businesses and things like that. But I've heard, it's funny. I've asked people about this who are long-term Portland residents, and some people say that they feel like it's kind of like, the spring after the winter, like everything's brightening up and coming back to life. And other people, I think, have a little bit, more negative view that maybe things will never be the same again. And so it's really interesting for me. I feel like I came in at a really weird time. Like everyone had kind of gone through this thing together, and then I come in as like the new person, and I don't really know what it was like before. I had never been here until a year ago, and so um, yeah, I think for me, it's a little bit of a blank slate. Like I don't really have that background here in the city. So for me, I'm just yeah, I'm coming in this like present moment and trying to kind of understand what everyone went through. And it's definitely something I love talking to Portlanders about. But yeah, I don't really have anything to compare it to, because I just got here pretty recently. So
Are there any cities you've contemplated moving to that you haven't gotten a chance to yet?
Oh yeah, there's so many. I mean, I think it's a little. I'm a little bit of a nomad at heart. I think I'm always kind of. We actually just bought a house, and I think it kind of freaked me out because it felt a little too permanent. Like I just think I'm always kind of ready to like get up and go somewhere new. So places I think so there's a city in the south of Brazil called Florianopolis, and I went there a few times, and there's something about it that really felt immediately comfortable to me. So I could kind of see myself living there one day. I also think the martyr in me, I kind of like rainy weather, but I can see myself living in London maybe. There seems to be a lot of heritage there. There's just so many places. I feel like every time I travel somewhere, can sort of envision myself living there, which is kind of like overwhelming. But I also really love the Southwest of the US. I think there's something really poetic about the landscape, and I don't know. I love San Francisco. There's just so many places. I don't know if I'll ever be able to like pick one place that feels the most like me because I'm so drawn to so many places. So
Cool. So, final question I wanted to ask, because a lot of people who listen to this podcast are aspiring authors or those aspiring to get into publishing. Do you have any advice as far as submitting short stories or essays out to websites and magazines and such?
yeah, I think I would just say like don't give up because you're going to get way more rejections than you get accepted. I think before any of my stories got accepted anywhere, I had upwards of 100 rejections. So I even kept a spreadsheet. I'm not a spreadsheet person, but I kept a spreadsheet to track how many rejections I got. And it kind of at first was really discouraging, but then I kind of started seeing it as sort of like really empowering, as in these are how many times I've tried, or these are how many times I've put myself out there, how many times I've said like I believe in this story, and so I think I wish I had started sooner submitting. Like I didn't start seriously submitting my stories to literary magazines and journals and contests until about 3 years ago. I kind of went through a spell where I didn't really have a direction. I didn't know like to do that. Like I kind of had this really vague idea of, well, one day I'll work with an agent and get a novel published or something like that. And I was writing during that time, but I didn't have this game plan of like, I'm going to research these places to submit to and make a schedule for myself of deadlines and start submitting. And that only started about 3 years ago. And I wish I had started sooner doing that because I think I learned so much from the process about not giving up, about believing in myself as a writer, and also you just learn to not take things personally, like, and I think that was really important to me because I had to truly see that a rejection was not a reflection on me as a person or on my story necessarily, although I think a lot of times rejections were a good thing because I needed to improve my story, but a lot of times it's just truly, I had to take the editor's word for it. It wasn't a good fit, that's what you hear over and over again. And I think that whole process has been so, I don't even know the word. I guess empowering is a little cliche, but it's been empowering, but it's also just taught me to be resilient and to not take it personally. So I wish I had started sooner. And I also wish I had just had a little bit of that attitudes sooner, because I took a lot of things personally in the beginning. And now I almost get happy when I get a rejection because it's like, oh, now I'm going to send that story out to somewhere else. It's like another step to take. It's like I know my next step to take.
Awesome. Well, that's very helpful, and I would like to thank you for taking the time to do this interview.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, this was really fun. Thanks for sitting down with me to chat.
In the Reads is the official podcast of Read Magazine, California's oldest literary journal. Find us online at www.readmag.org. Thank you for listening.